today's the day. I know you guys have been waiting for it. This is what we did with the Landspeeder build. A couple of things to clarify before we begin. One, not every part of this build was filmed purely because of the time constraints, and also there was a lot of sanding. So some segments of this have been filmed and some are going to be in pictures. So sorry it's not all filmed, but it's a lot of basic stuff that I haven't filmed that you guys have seen me do in past videos, and I will explain it as well as I can through the medium of audio. And two, this isn't actually a full build from scratch. What we did was we actually found a Landspeeder on eBay, and we have actually modified and improved upon that particular prop. Because honestly, you wouldn't really know where to begin with making a Landspeeder. So the prop that we had gave us a really good base to work off, but it needed a lot of TLC and a lot of improvements before we could even think about bringing it to the convention circuits. So this is kind of what it looked like at the beginning. We've already started taking things apart at this point. You see we've taken out the interior and taken off some of the detail pieces, and at this stage just kind of looking at what needs to be done, because this is basically just a painted wooden shell. The wood hasn't been treated in any way. The engine pods, which aren't on the back in this shot, but they're essentially made out of wood and polystyrene and filler, so there's quite a lot of damage on there, and everything was kind of falling apart. All the wooden seams were starting to crack. Where damp had got in some bits, it was damaging the wood as well. So it was a case of just figuring out what needed to be repaired before we got on to actually restoring the whole body. So the first issue was fixing all the cracks in the front nose. That's where the worst of it was. Also had some cracks near the cockpit and also the back engine, so I had to make sure they were glued together, make sure they were filled and reinforced, so they won't be going anywhere anytime soon. Some of the weaker points in the engine pods where they'd done it so you can slot it all together, but unfortunately that meant a lot of it was wobbly, so like if you knocked into it, a lot of it would shake, and that could put pressure on some of the other points for the Landspeeder. So we didn't want things to be easily broken because a lot of people are going to be walking around it, so a lot of the weak points were reinforced with fiberglass. Also gave the whole of the body a sand down just to remove all the dirt and grime that had built up on top of the paint, and start removing some of the top layers of paint, because they've done a black wash that covered the whole body, so just kind of getting rid of that so you can get it prepped to actually doing the proper bodywork on it. Also started removing some pieces and replacing them with some 3D printed parts that my buddy Jai did for us. If you need anything 3D printed and you wanted it printed well, if you can't find a file for it, if you need something mocked up, Jai is the guy to go to. His online username is GeekandCosplay. I'll link his stuff down in the description below. So we did some really good work and helped us out in building a lot of custom parts that will actually fit what we already had on the speeder, because this speeder isn't screen accurate at all. If we're going for a screen accurate speeder, we couldn't use this speeder as a base because too many things were disproportionate to each other. I work on the philosophy of, with props, you don't have to get it screen accurate. As long as it looks good, it's okay. If you're going to go for things screen accurate, then of course that's absolutely fine if that's what you want to do. But we decided earlier on, this is going to kind of be our version of the Landspeeder. It's going to look very close to it. To someone who doesn't know every single detail of the Landspeeder, that's Luke Skywalker's Landspeeder. At the end of the day, you're going to look at that and go, oh damn, that's a Landspeeder. So some of the 3D printed parts are a bit bigger, a bit smaller in certain different areas to what you can compare with on the screen version, but the end result still looks amazing. So we knew that there was going to be electrics on this build later down the line, so I had to put in some tubes in places like the back of the engine and cut through into the back of the body. So I had to do that before we started reinforcing the whole thing, because otherwise you just wouldn't be able to cut into it. One major detail of the speeder we did decide to change was actually the length of the speeder. Now, when it originally came to us, it was actually a bit too long, so we took out about 3/4 of a meter's worth of the front nose and just shortened the whole thing and made sure it was all reinforced and the seams lined up as well. We weren't entirely sure if we were going to do it, but honestly doing that made it look so much better and so much more into proportion than what it was. Also had to pretty much completely take apart one of the back engine pods, because in the film if you're sitting in it, it's the left engine pod. It's actually got a load of damage on it, so the top of the engine's off. You can see all the internal bits, you can see all the wires coming out. And on the Landspeeder when we got it, all three of the engine pods were the same. They're all just rounded, they were closed, there was no battle damage, no engine parts whatsoever. So one half of the engine pod had to be cut out, which is quite difficult, we found, because it's got a cross section of wood in the middle with polystyrene around the edge, so some parts of it weren't very sturdy and other parts of it were incredibly sturdy. So trying to cut out the shape was a little bit awkward, but we just managed to get it done with a little bit of jimmying with a saw. So there was a nice gap in there to add a 3D printed engine at a later date. And the other big change to the original base sort of shape of the speeder was we got rid of the caster wheels that it was on. Now caster wheels are fine if you're wheeling something across a flat floor. We have big chunky caster wheels for the TARDIS. Now the TARDIS is, compared to the Landspeeder, a tall narrow object, so caster wheels for that are fine. It might struggle a little bit on surfaces that are really bouncy, but for the most part it's not that bad to transport, and it's flat packed, so you don't actually have to wheel the entire body of the TARDIS around if you don't want to. For the Landspeeder, when it was delivered, tried to wheel it onto the drive and immediately one of the caster wheels snapped off, so the Landspeeder was doing this, trying to get onto the drive. So that was something that definitely needed to be changed. So Dad had the idea of actually making a custom chassis for this. You know, someone that does a lot of metal work, so was able to give him the dimensions for the chassis we needed, which means that we could actually have this up off the ground a little bit more with big proper tyres, so we can get this through convention floors, we can go outside, pretty much on any terrain, and it also allows for a steering shaft, so you can actually sit in it and turn the wheel, and the front wheels will actually go left and right, so it makes it a hell of a lot easier to try and maneuver it around somewhere than having about 4 people trying to push the Landspeeder and trying to get the caster wheels to go in the right direction. Having a chassis also means that you can have suspension in there, so when you get in the Landspeeder, you've got the added benefit of it moves, so it kind of feels like it's hovering a little bit, which is also quite cool. So now all the main fixes to the body had been done, it was time to reinforce the whole thing, so we use Kevlar for this. Kevlar is essentially like a woven, almost silk kind of like material that is like really strong. Like the fabric just by itself, you can't cut it with normal scissors, is incredibly hard to cut with a blade. But to actually make Kevlar super strong, you mix it with a special resin that it comes with. So you put the Kevlar on, you put the resin over the top, you make sure it all soaks through, sticks to what you're applying it to, leave it to dry, and it's basically rock solid. Back in the day, some people did used to use Kevlar for armour on Robot Wars. Robot Wars, it wasn't very good though, because people had like giant pneumatic axes, which would probably go through that. But those were the days. That's the only reason I know Kevlar exists, is because of Robot Wars. So getting it to go on the body is kind of tricky, because obviously you're not just working with a flat surface. With the Landspeeder, it's got lots of curves and lots of like different intricate bits, so we just had to kind of cut it out in pieces and stick it down and hoped it kind of worked. It did mean that on the front of the body that there'd be a lot more filler work to do, because obviously you've got to hide all the seams and a little bit of overlap on the Kevlar to make sure that the front is actually going to be a nice smooth shape. You're not going to see lots of lumps and bumps. But now this also does mean I can literally stand on the very front of the nose, jump up and down, and that thing is not going to snap off like it was trying to do when we first got it. So Kevlar was used for the main body and also round the 3 engine pods, just to make sure that, again, they were solid, because like I said, the interior was made of polystyrene, and they used like a kind of fabricy mesh to go over the top and polyfiller to go over that, so you can just punch it, not even very hard, just kind of softly, and you'd make a dent in the side of the engine pod. So obviously you don't really want that to happen. And it also made sure that 3D printed parts that we put on the front and the back of the engine were definitely not going to go anywhere. For the other more intricate bits and getting in the corners and along the bottom where Kevlar would have been an absolute nightmare to apply, that was just all done in fiberglass. So again, it's still reinforced, not as strong as Kevlar, but with the rest of it being in Kevlar, the whole body is pretty much like rock solid now. So a couple of more of the 3D printed details were added around the engine pods, just so the edges can blend in, make sure it actually looked like it was part of it. And then it was just the case of filling, priming, filling, priming, filling, priming, which if you're a prop maker is probably the worst part of any prop to do, because it just involves all your life sanding. Just days worth of sanding. That's the thing, that's all I did on my days off for a short while. So I think All in all, we counted it was 11 tins of filler, and I'm not talking the tins of filler that I normally get for my products, which are that big. This is industrial grade filler, and it comes in cans that are about that big. 11 cans for the whole body. So this is where there is no video of this, but you guys know the drill if you've done any prop builds that kind of require lots of sanding. So it's a case of putting a layer of filler on, sanding it down, priming it, see what bits you've missed, what bits need more, filling, sanding, priming, filling, sanding, priming. The primer we used was also a 2-pack filler primer, so it did help with buffing out all the 3D print lines in the pieces as well, but it did mean you need to wet and dry sand your filler primer before you did anything else, because filler primer tends to be a bit more gritty than normal primer. So once you've actually done with the filler and you've added the primer, you need to wet and dry sand the whole thing before you do paint, and to make sure that everything's nice and smooth. Thankfully, with the Landspeeder being a damaged thing, you don't have to get every single dent out of the body. You'd be there for ages. You can just incorporate that in your paint job a little bit later, and it looks like you totally meant to do it, and it's meant to be there, and I think it adds to the character. If it's not got a little bit of damage in it, then there's no point in having all the lovely weathering paintwork that we're moving on to after the filler primer horrible stage of that stuff. Ugh. I love painting stuff, even though I didn't really get to do the painting. I only really got to do the weathering, because Dad is the one that has experience of actually painting cars, and this is essentially a big car. So it took an entire day to do the paint job, so it's a good job he did it, because he has experience with it and is not going to do any screw-ups like I probably would with the paint gun. But it was still a long process. Your filler primer has been sanded down, it's ready to go. The first colour you're going to put on there is a base colour of silver. So this is the base colour for weathering. Again, if any of you guys have followed me for a while, you know that if I do weathering on props, especially if it's a metal prop, always start with a base colour of silver. So instead of dry brushing silver on, what you do is you take away the top layer of paint, like if you've got silver, like say a pistol, you've got silver, a layer of black. What you do is you gently sand away the layer of black and the silver comes through underneath. It's kind of the same principle here. So you got the base layer of silver, let that dry, and then what I did was I went round all the places that is going to have like big chunks of silver showing through with masking tape, and just cut out all these little custom shapes. For the most part, they're on the sides where the cockpit is, and also on the front curved area of the nose. Next step was adding the actual base colour for the Landspeeder itself. Now, this was actually kind of a silver lining moment, because originally we got the colour wrong. We went and got some colour mix, thought we got the right colour for the speeder. Once we sprayed it on, we realised it was way too dark. I mean, you can do a patch test on something and the colour looks okay, but once you apply it to something that's really big like this, you just go, that's not quite right. So we're umming and ahhing whether we're going to keep it that colour, or if we had to go quickly run to the paint store before they shut to go get some more paint, because we had to finish that paint job that day. There was no other options. So I stood there, I stared at it for a bit, and I went, no, it's too dark, we can't do this colour. So I went out, got some more paint, came back, took a while to try and figure out what paint to get, because they couldn't mix up any of the colours that we really wanted, so we ended up having to do our own with a can of white paint and a bunch of tints to try and get as close as we could to the Landspeeder colour. So we sprayed that over the top of the orange, and it looked a lot better. So again, it was still kind of an orangey colour. You look at different pictures of the Landspeeder, it's awkward. Like this toy version, this is kind of like a bright orange yellow. In other pictures, it's more of a darker orange. In other pictures, it's got more of a pink hue. The joys of actually trying to colour match an old prop. I don't think it's 100% perfect what we've done on ours, but I think it looks really good, and I'm very happy with the colour, considering that the stress we had on thinking, oh dear God, have we done this completely wrong? But as I said, it's quite fortuitous what we did, and that will be explained later on in the weathering section. So the base orange colour had dried, and it was the, once again, very tedious task of doing more masking. So the Landspeeder's got all these like burgundy sort of stripes that will run down certain areas across the back, on the engines, of course on the front. So we had to do that with like automotive painter's tape, which is like this thin tape that actually stretches, so you can do like big curves with it. You don't have to sit there and cut curves out with a Stanley blade. And so it took a good hour or so, I think, to mask everything up and just make sure that everything else was definitely covered in newspaper and there were no holes and no gaps, because the last thing you want is a load of paint bleed to come through, especially when you're doing it with the big paint gun, because it's going to be a lot harder to try and cover it if you get a big splotch of red where it shouldn't be. And as you can see by this clip, it was starting to get dark at this stage, but we just managed to get it done. We got the burgundy on there, waited for it to dry a little bit, and then removed all of the masking tape because we couldn't leave it on overnight, because otherwise the glue of the tape would start to react and it'll start gumming up all the paint. So this is the final result for that paint job. As you can see, it kind of looks a bit like one of the toys, with a very simple, very basic paint job, with just the very basic sort of start of where the weathering's gonna be. So I think it was Comic-Con the day after that, so went to Comic-Con, and then on the day after that went back and started doing the weathering work. Now this is my area, this is where I like to be. I like taking things and making it look like it has a purpose and used and worn. So the weathering for this is actually pretty easy. So basically you just got a motorized sander, had some really fine sandpaper pads on there, and just went over the whole body, especially around the front, to sort of blend out all the edges of the silver bits we'd previously done. And you can see the orange for the wrong paint color we did starting to come through on certain patches, and it actually looks really cool. It gives it that sort of extra dimension of that could be like a red primer layer, or that could be an old paint job that was covered over from maybe a previous owner. It just gives it a little bit of extra life, so that was definitely a silver lining moment with that dodgy orange colour. So just making sure we took away a load of the hard edges on where I'd done all the silver parts, taking away some of the paint on the burgundy paint strips, just make it look worn, but we didn't want to make it look like dirty. We did a little bit of dirt though, and this was in the form of the trusty chalkboard paint. The weathering paint job that the previous owner of the Landspeeder had done before we got it, obviously it was just basically a basic hand paint job. The weathering was all done by hand, just painted on over the top, and also they'd done a dark acrylic wash over the whole thing. So it just really darkened down the whole tone of it and just made it look really grimy and horrible. Now with a Landspeeder being something that's going to travel through the desert, something that Dad was saying was you're not really going to get dirt on it. It's just mostly going to take away the paint because it's being sandblasted, so sandblasting isn't going to create dirt, it's just going to create paint effects. So didn't want too much dirt on there, so the only places that I really added the chalkboard paint to was just on the front dent, just for the idea that that hit something and the dirt just got stuck in all the little bits of metal and couldn't quite get it sort of out of there. Just around the edges of sort of the skirting, the aluminium basket, I'm not sure what exactly it's called on the Landspeeder. Around the footwell, where you actually put your foot in to actually stand up and get into the cockpit. Around the top bit of that cockpit as well, because I thought, well, that's where it's got some strong weathering as well. And probably going to be where people do also put their feet in if you're going to get into the Landspeeder, trying to think in universe, so that's on both sides of the cockpit. Just a little bit in sort of the places where there is indentations and deep grooves in the bodywork, and also around the engines to kind of make it seem like there's a lot of dirt coming out of the engines. They're quite old, so they're going to stain the paint over the years, they're going to mark it, so there's a little bit more dirt to the back than there is around the front, but again, I didn't want to go overboard with it, and chalkboard paint is really good for working with, not like acrylic paint. One, that it will stick to the paint body a lot more, and two, it also dries really quickly, so you can do different paint effects with it. You can just dab it on, leave it to dry for a bit and wipe it off, and the edge of the paint stays on, but you wiped off the middle. It kind of looks like a blast mark or just some weird scoring that's gone on, or you can water it down and dab it on and make it look like this sort of faded sort of dirt pattern. It's a really nice paint to use, and it also works really well on armour, which is what I've done for my armour, so you can go back and look at my other videos if you want to see more uses of chalkboard paint. As I said, I did add the chalkboard paint around the aluminium bars, so that was one of the last things that actually got done on the Speeder. The original sort of vent bars around the side were just done in really thin strips of like MDF. The damp had got to them, they were falling apart, so literally just ripped that whole thing off. Again, the same person that did the chassis was able to help out with these. We just got a load of bars that were already cut to length to what we needed, and just kind of figured out what kind of bend needed to be in the front of the bar. Sent that off to the guy who does all the metal work, and he was able to bend the rest of the bars to the correct shape, stick them all together, put it in the side, weather it up a bit, and it looks amazing. So now the body is pretty much done. The last thing to do was finish off the engine pods. So obviously the engine pod that has had the most work done to it is that left exposed engine. So in here is a big 3D printed part that makes it look like it's the inside of the engine, which, fun fact, Jai found out was looking through reference photos to try and find the correct thing to actually put in there for the engine. It's actually IG-88's head. And IG-88's head was actually used making bits from the old Cantina set. So a lot of prop recycling going on. People forget, Star Wars was a low budget film. They reused bits wherever they could. So that's the base for that there, and you can see underneath we've also got some LED lighting. So that's all connected to a little battery pack in the back just to give it a little bit more dimension. There's also a bunch of different wires coming out of it that were all part of an old radio that was found on eBay, so we just bought that, took it apart, used all the wires, a couple of other bits of tubes that we already had, some bits that Dad already had, which are just disused car parts. So it's a very simple thing, just a quick repaint of a 3D printed piece and covered in wires, but again, it looks really cool, especially with the added lighting. There is also lighting in the back of all three of the engines, so in kind of like a sort of turbo thruster part. So the middle bit is blue and the outside edge is yellow, again just to kind of give the whole idea that it's like a jet engine. Again, not accurate to the thing, but just a nice little detail that when someone's actually looking at this prop up close, they go, oh, look at that, that's pretty cool. And again, it's something that adds a little bit more life to it. There are some other lights kind of hidden around, I say hidden, they're dotted around the body. We've got some on the repulsors, which are actually on the back of the main body of the Landspeeder. And there's also some in like the front circuit box. So again, on the left hand side, just in front of the cockpit, there is like a little bit of exposed circuitry and things that are on the Landspeeder that originally wasn't there on the prop that we got. So again, that was an addition, just had to cut that out, make a little box. Again, it's just old circuitry, old bits of wiring and circuit boards, and a couple of like NOS canisters from an old car, and just added some LEDs in there as well. So again, those all flash, just gives it a little bit of life. And the final bit of electronics that were added was the back middle engine. And so in all three of the engines, the middle of the cowl is covered with a little just quick 3D printed fan. Again, a small detail not in the original one, but just something we added to that, and needed for the middle one specifically because hidden behind that is a speaker. So I've been hinting at Paul from TRamp has been helping us out with the big project, and this is it. So what he was able to do was he was able to provide us with a custom soundboard for the Landspeeder. So the speaker at the back connected to the soundboard, which runs through into a control panel that we've installed in the cockpit. The control panel controls all the lights throughout the Landspeeder, and also has an engine start button. If you push that in and hold it down, you get the sound of the engine actually starting up. And if you hold it down, you got just the continuous loop noise of the engine just running. And when you let the button go, you can just hear the engine powering down and then shutting off. For a first event, that was actually quite a big hit with the kids to say, like, you know, you can start the engine. So a lot of them would be sitting there like starting the engine, holding the button down and being like, oh man, that's really cool. So again, thank you to Paul for helping us out on that one. So with all the paint effects done, all the electronics finding in place, the last bits to fit in was the actual cockpit section itself. So the old seats were taken out obviously at the very beginning of the build. What they'd done for the original seats was just squares of Celotex covered in fake leather. So you get in it and you sit down, and it's incredibly uncomfortable because it's just a really big, just solid chunk of stuff you're just sitting on. It's not comfortable whatsoever. So again, this was Dad's idea. The chairs that are actually in the Landspeeder are office chairs that have just been stripped apart and cut down enough that they can actually fit inside the cockpit. So they've kind of got the right shape going on to them that kind of sort of matches what was in the film. And also they're really squidgy and super comfortable, and you could legit sit in that Landspeeder all day. So in the middle of the office chairs is actually the arms for the chairs that were taken off, and just got the padding in there just to cover where there's a slight gap in the middle. Again, you wouldn't really know they were there unless we told you that those were arms for office chairs. Instead of repainting the whole of the inside red like the original Speeder was, decided to actually deck it out in a little bit of vinyl and also carpet. Actually make it seem a little bit more modern and also really cozy and not filthy at all. Even has its own car mats. Because obviously, as I said, people are going to be sitting in this. You want it to look comfortable, clean and inviting, which it kind of didn't when it first rocked up. The windshield got put back on, I've resprayed the boxes that sit on the dash and fixed up any issues with them. So those got attached back on. Like I said, we had the little control panel. That isn't anywhere to be seen on the original one and is a bit probably too modern for a Landspeeder, but still looks cool. Just a mock-up of a screen sitting in the middle and also a brand new gear stick. That was just an old gear stick head found on eBay, and I just used the original box that they'd made up for the gear stick in the old Landspeeder. Again, just repainted it, put the new gear stick head on top, added a couple of extra bits we had lying around, like a spare circuit board, a couple of guitar knobs that we're originally going to use for Chewbacca's bowcaster, weathered it up a little bit, and voila. One complete Landspeeder. The last thing that was needed to finish it off was actually the setting for it to go in, so we got some custom printed display back pieces by a company called Display Wizard. Found a couple of photos on Shutterstock of the prequel setting for Tatooine that still exists out in Tunisia but is slowly kind of going into disrepair, so fans go out there and take a load of pictures, so you can get royalty-free pictures for that. And we found two that were quite similar that we could merge together in the corner to actually make it look like one big wraparound set. And the floor itself is actually a yellow AstroTurf. Again, just to kind of make it look a little bit like sand, and when you're walking on it you kind of got that texture as well. It's just trying to make the whole thing like one big experience. The only thing we didn't have for sci-fi was we'd ordered some custom cut mirrors to go around the wheels so it would reflect the ground up and you don't really notice that there's wheels there. So what we had to do was just get a bit of fabric that kind of closely matches the floor colour, just wrap them around the wheels so you don't see these big chunky wheels sitting out the bottom of what's supposed to be something that's hovering. So the main question we got asked at Sci-Fi was how long did this take to put together? I'm thinking if you condense all the time down into sort of just, if you were to work on this day in day out for like say 10 hours a day, it would probably take about 3 weeks. But in reality, oh Jesus, when did we have it? The Landspeeder got delivered end of last year, and as I said, we got it finished day before Sci-Fi. Obviously didn't start work on it until the weather improved a little bit, so started work on it early spring, and a few months later got it finished. So fingers crossed, we're working on trying to get this into some big events this year, and see, once we've got a couple of events under our belt, hopefully we'll be able to take it out more regularly for events in the next coming years. So Desert Speeder is going to be its own separate thing, as it's a photo experience that you'll be charging for people to go sit in it. So it's separate to the Imperial Outlanders, it's separate to Ace Cosplay, but obviously with me being head of Imperial Outlanders and also working on the Desert Speeder, they'll probably both end up appearing at the same event, so you'll have Outlanders with the Speeder as well. But if you want to follow the adventures of the Desert Speeder, I will link in all its social medias down below. See, there's not a huge amount on there at the moment because it's only just been born, but I think once I make this video live I'll probably end up putting posts on there of actual build pictures so people can see kind of how it started off live as to how it is now. So there you go, I hope you enjoyed this video. I for one am happy that the Speeder is finished because that was a very big time sink and the reason things have been so quiet on here lately, but hopefully we're going to be back on schedule. That does tend to happen, big projects just suddenly appear and then I disappear and then I come back and then ta-da! But yeah, also, you know, Mysterio is currently in the works, and the Sev armour is still to be done by the end of this year or early next year, depending on what's going on. So as always, a big thank you has got to go out to my supporters on Patreon who help me keep making stuff on this channel, especially to Jeff Kenny, and of course, thank you guys so much for watching. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and as always, may the Force be with you.